I think it would be a monstrous act of cultural vandalism for Cook's Cottage to be levelled. He had a great deal of respect for the Aboriginal people, and this idea that he was some kind of a monster full of white privilege and settler colonialism, it's attempting to put 21st century cultural Marxism on a deeply humane leading member of the 18th century Enlightenment.
2025 is a year of change. Cultural and political disruption is transforming our nation and the global order. The rebellion against the establishment has accelerated. Australia and the Western Alliance is now at a crossroads. Either the mainstream will continue its ascendancy or the elites will prevail. Hello Tony, and g'day to all of our viewers and listeners. Great to be back. Today we'll be talking about the Palestine protesters, the burning of the Australian flag, the destruction of Captain Cook Cottage, net zero, and the latest developments from the United States. Tony, thanks for being with us again.
As always, Dan, wonderful to be with you.
All right, we'll start with the protests that took place in Sydney and also in Melbourne over the last weekend in relation to Palestine and the protesters there. It took over the Sydney Harbour Bridge, shut that down for a number of hours. There was a fairly large number of protesters, at least based on the footage that I saw. Just interested in your thoughts, Tony, on what that meant for our country.
Well, Dan, where do I start? There's so much that's wrong that was illustrated by this particular protest. I guess the obvious thing is that these people are effectively protesting in favour of Hamas, a terrorist organisation, because if Israel stops the war, Hamas have won, and Israel should not stop the war until A, all the hostages have been released, B, Hamas is disarmed, and C, Hamas and the people of Gaza more generally recognise Israel's right to exist behind secure borders. So it's all very well for people like Keir Starmer in Britain to be talking about recognising Palestine if Israel doesn't do X, Y and Z. Well, recognition of Palestine should not be a way of punishing Israel, bullying Israel. It should be a means of rewarding the Palestinians for doing good things. So I wouldn't even begin to talk about recognising Palestine until Hamas has surrendered the hostages, it's disarmed itself, and it's accepted Israel's right to exist behind secure borders. Then you could start to think about recognition of Palestine, although obviously there are various technical criteria which any state is supposed to meet before recognition. But to get more deeply into these protests, Dan, since when were political decisions made by judges? This is a protest that both the Premier and the opposition leader thought should not go ahead. And yet the protest organiser, a professional protester, a self-declared Trotskyite, went before the capitalist courts, as it were, the fascist courts, as it were, to overturn the decision of the democratically elected and accountable Premier. Since when did judges make political decisions? There is something very wrong in this instance and in quite a few other instances lately where we've got judges going into areas which are essentially the realm of politics. Now, this is going to bring both the executive arm and the judicial arm into disrepute. The executive arm because ministers and premiers and prime ministers won't be able to do what the public expect governments to do for them. And it's going to bring the judicial arm into disrepute because over time you're going to have more and more judges pontificating on things like climate change or on things like Palestine instead of sticking to the standard job of judges, which is to interpret laws which traditionally, whatever values they may have been designed to uphold, have been expressed very much in technical, procedural, objective terms. And I guess when Parliament passes bad laws, you tempt judges to do bad things. So, look, the final point I want to make about this protest, Dan, is that I really would like to see the same vigour applied to policing Palestinian protests that was applied to the policing of freedom protests during the pandemic. These pro-Hamas, supposedly pro-Palestinian protests are no longer an exercise in freedom of speech, if they ever were. They are now an attempt to intimidate. If they must happen, they should happen in some place, the back and beyond, where protesters can make their point without disrupting or bullying the general public. These are no longer an exercise in freedom of speech, if they ever were. They're an exercise in bullying and intimidation. Let's stand up for the right of the public to go about their business without these sorts of disruptions for the first time in a couple of years.
If you were in the position of Chris Minns and facing that court ruling that you pointed out, what is it that you think you would have done? Would you have sort of tried to have gotten the police to have stopped it and prevented it and disrupted the protesters? Would you have allowed it to go ahead? What do you think you might have done?
Well, it's a good question, Dan. In the first instance, I would have urgently appealed the judge's ruling. And in the second instance, I think we probably need to change the law so that judges aren't interfering in these things. Whether a protest, the conditions under which a protest can go ahead should not be a matter for a judge. It should be a matter for the elected and the accountable government of the day, the police minister, the premier. Elected and accountable people should be making political decisions, and that was an eminently political decision that should never have been made by a judge.
To me, it was also, I think, further evidence that something has gone badly wrong with our migration system. We've talked about the massive surge to the numbers, and that's also been underpinned by an ideology of multiculturalism, which suggests that there's many cultures in Australia rather than one culture, which is a majority culture within which different ethnic groups can exist and religious beliefs can exist, but there is an Australian culture and an Australian way of life, which has now been diluted. And to see those protesters gathering in that fashion, to me, was an example of something that has gone very wrong in our country. Did you have those same sort of instincts when you saw it?
Well, I did have something similar in mind, Dan. There does seem to have been a pretty large migrant presence in all of these supposedly pro-Palestine, but actually pro-Hamas and Jew-hating protests. And I think that is quite concerning. You see, no one has to come to Australia. All of our migrants choose to come here, and in choosing to come here, you're accepting the whole deal, not just access to the Australian job market, not just access to our wonderful way of life, but you should also be choosing acceptance of our values. And our values include understanding and appreciating our Jewish fellow Australians. It includes making judgments about foreign policy on the basis of Australia's national interest, not on the national interest of, let's say, Gaza. It means we are a secular society, so you don't treat people differently because of their religion. You don't, for instance, think that religion X is always in the wrong, religion Y is always in the right. You don't think differently of people because of their sex or their gender, their country of birth, their language. And my fear, based on what we've seen on our streets over the last couple of years, is that too many of our recent migrants, particularly from the Middle East, don't really accept Australian values. And while we should never discriminate in our immigration policy on the basis of race or religion, I think we are entitled to discriminate on the basis of values. And the whole point of the citizenship test, which was introduced back in 2007 by the Howard government and has been continued to this day, is that it is supposed to be about insisting that all our new citizens, in other words, migrants who seek permanent residency and to become Australian, that all our new citizens know what's expected of them and accept it. They don't just give it lip service on the day they take their citizenship oath or affirmation. They know it, they mean it, they live it. And it's a real worry that too many people in modern Australia don't seem to accept that the Jewish people of this country have a right to go about their lives unmolested, and it is in Australia's national interest that the only liberal democracy in the Middle East is able to survive, and it can't survive if its neighbours are pledged to its destruction.
Well, related to that is what happened at the Melbourne protest, where a number of protesters burned the Australian flag and wrote in chalk on the ground to abolish Australia. Now, I'm not suggesting this was representative of all of these protesters, and Jacinta Allen, the Premier of Victoria, said that these actions were deplorable, but I don't think she really means it because, of course, there's no consequence for engaging in this behaviour. So how can you say that you disagree with it if there's no punishment for it? So, look, my view is that no self-respecting nation can allow its flag to be burned, and I think there should be repercussions for it. However, there's also a free speech argument, which is, well, as deplorable as it is, it should be permitted in our country. I'm just interested in your thoughts on that matter.
Well, look, I'm a bit torn on this, Dan. I agree that it's highly disrespectful. It is deplorable to burn the Australian flag. I guess I draw a distinction between someone who does it because they've got a problem with some action of the Australian government, or someone who does it because they are fundamentally out of sorts with our country itself. And it was noteworthy in the Sydney Harbour Bridge protest that at least there were no Australian flags to be seen, not that I could see anyway. By geez, there were a lot of Palestinian flags.
And Aboriginal.
I think there were even some Indigenous flags and no Australian flags. So again, what's really happening here? It seems to me that with Indigenous separatism, which the Green Left have been pushing now for decades, and with extreme multiculturalism, we've got too many people who are either uncomfortable with or actively reject the idea of Australia itself. Certainly Australia as a country with a strong Judeo-Christian ethos and a country with a core Anglo-Celtic culture. And look, the deal, if you come to Australia, has got to be that you accept that you are living in what is essentially an Anglo-Celtic culture with what is very much a strong Judeo-Christian ethos. And again, I get back to the point we've been making earlier, that I don't think that is fully accepted by all of our recent migrants, and I don't think it's sufficiently stressed by government at every level. I mean, the point that officialdom has got to make at every level to everyone who comes to this country is you are not living in Hotel Australia. You are joining Team Australia. And the minute you opt for permanent residency come citizenship in this country, it's our values, it's our way of life, it's our national interest that you've got to embrace.
Did anything like this happen when you were Prime Minister? I'm just curious because I haven't heard Anthony Albanese say anything on this matter. Do you, if it didn't happen, but if you were in the position of the current Prime Minister, would you have weighed in on this matter as Prime Minister, or would you have probably left it at a state matter?
Look, I think it's impossible for the Prime Minister not to speak out on important issues of the day. And we sometimes bemoan the fact that the federal government fiddles in areas which are the state's responsibility and vice versa. But when you've got something which is contrary to our national ethos, as I think these Jew-hating protests very much are, well, I think it is the responsibility of people at every level of leadership to make the point.
Well, also related to this is the Captain Cook's Cottage, which is here in Melbourne, in East Melbourne. And recently there were reports that the Melbourne City Council, I think these were documents from 2023, but they were recently unearthed, had a plan to demolish and shut down the cottage because it was inconsistent with the ethos of so-called truth-telling, and it was a reminder of our terrible colonial past, and I'm not too sure whether those plans are going ahead. But it does show that, one of the reasons why certainly myself, and I assume people like yourself as well, are so concerned about concepts of voice, treaty and truth is we know that is fundamentally about the erasure of Australia's colonial past and the institutions that developed as a consequence of that. And this is just another example of that happening.
Dead right, Dan. I think it would be a monstrous act of cultural vandalism for Cook's Cottage to be levelled. It was erected almost a century ago, as I recall, as a tribute to one of history's greatest explorers, one of history's greatest navigators. And let's not forget that as a man of his time, Cook was remarkably enlightened. Not only was he a brilliant sailor, but he more or less was the first to deal effectively with scurvy on long voyages. He was a scientist of rare distinction in terms of the way he appropriately plotted and observed the transit of Venus and so on. And he was, as anyone who's even a bit familiar with his journals would know, he had a great deal of respect for the Aboriginal people. Yes, on 2 occasions on Cook's first voyage, a musket was discharged when Cook's crew thought they were in some danger. But particularly up at Cooktown, where the Endeavour was for about 6 weeks being repaired after hitting the Great Barrier Reef, particularly up at Cooktown, there was reasonably friendly relations between Cook and his crew and the local Aboriginal people. And once he left Australia, he wrote in his journals that he thought that in many respects the Aboriginal people, while primitive by the standards of Britain in the 1770s, they were much happier, he said, than we were, referring to Englishmen of his time, because they didn't have what in those days, even in those days, was a kind of a consumer culture and this constant want this, want that. So Cook was quite sensible as to the strengths of the Aboriginal way of life. And this idea that he was some kind of a monster, full of white privilege and settler colonialism, it's attempting to put 21st century cultural Marxism on a deeply humane leading member of the 18th century Enlightenment.
All right, one other issue domestically I wanted to get your views on is net zero, particularly in terms of the recent developments. So over the last couple of weeks in Parliament, there was Barnaby Joyce put his private member's bill into Parliament to repeal net zero. And there was also Senator Pauline Hanson who had a similar motion in the Senate. Now, Senator Hanson's motion was voted on. Only 2 on the coalition side voted in favour of it, Senator Antic and Senator Canavan. 2 voted against it and the remainder abstained. It feels like there is now a lot more momentum within the coalition to dump net zero. I think that that's going to happen this year. I very much think that before the next sitting, the Nationals will have dumped it and the Liberals will follow pretty promptly from that. But just interested in your perspective on how this is now shaping up.
Well, Dan, at the risk of being overly subtle, I have, I suppose, an intellectual position and a political position. Intellectually, I think that net zero is all right as a long-term aspiration, but as a hard and fast policy law or as a hard and fast piece of legislation, I think that it's exceedingly dangerous and damaging. And had I been in the Parliament, or certainly had I been leading the Liberal Party, there would have been no adoption of net zero back in 2021, I think it was.
I must say at the time I wondered whether Scott Morrison was doing it because it was the quid pro quo for the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal. Speaking subsequently to senior members of the coalition, I gather it was more worry about carbon tariffs being applied to us by the EU and others. But even so, I don't believe it should have been done because the truth is that we aren't going to get to net zero anytime soon, and trying to get to net zero anytime soon is going to cause massive damage to our economy, massive harm to our jobs, to our industries, and to people's cost of living. Now let's talk about the politics of this. My instinct is that politicians rarely do well when they're talking about what is essentially a theological issue. And I think net zero has become a theological point. And what really matters here is what is the government going to do today, tomorrow, and in coming years to benefit the country. And so rather than arguing over the theology of net zero, understandable though I think Barnaby and others' position is, I think the important thing is for the coalition to develop a much better policy on these things than the Albanese government. So my position on net zero, were I still in the parliament, would be, look, I'm not opposed to net zero, but I'm utterly opposed to all the crazy things that this government is doing to achieve it. That'd be my position. And I'd be saying, look, there's absolutely no point having new emissions targets for 2035 when we're not even going to achieve our emissions targets for 2030. And by the way, give us your cost estimates for achieving the emissions targets for 2030, because the government's never come clean about this. And we've had all sorts of credible estimates, including a tri-university study involving a former Australian chief scientist that estimated that even by 2030, our progress towards net zero was going to cost something like $1.5 trillion. I mean, these are mind-boggling figures on top of all the expense that we've already had. So I would be opposing any new targets. I would be demanding much more detail on the existing targets, and I'd have an energy policy which is about affordable and reliable electricity, not about wrecking the system in order to reduce emissions. So on energy, no more coal-fired power stations can close until there's a reliable alternative. We've got to get more gas out of the ground with absolute express speed. We should have no subsidies whatsoever for new renewables and for all these other things which are effectively part of the whole renewable push, like electric cars, because if renewables really are cheap, they don't need subsidies. And yes, we should end the nuclear ban. So, as I said, I think the important thing is, what is the coalition going to do today, tomorrow, this year, next year, this decade, next decade, to actually make life better for people, as opposed to arguing over what is the theology, effectively the climate theology of net zero. That's my view. I'm not opposed to net zero, given where we are, but utterly opposed to this government's insane, self-harming, almost economically suicidal policies to get there.
Well, of course, when you were opposition leader, you defeated the ETS and morphed into the carbon tax. And I can remember at the time, the ETS, if you were to have opinion surveys, was considered popular by the public, in part because it sounded like a good idea with little consequence. And that was the same as The Voice. The Voice was very popular until there was a contest and it became apparent to the community what it really meant. Isn't it the case that Because I hear all the time, well, net zero is popular and wind and solar are popular. Yeah, sure, because people haven't equated that to the reason why their energy bills are going up. As soon as they understand that, it won't be popular anymore. What the coalition needs is not a 12-month review. They need to immediately create a contest with Labor on this matter so that in 3 years' time, the public understands why their bills are going up.
I agree. We can spend far too much time reviewing. What we actually need is some deciding. And my position as party leader, and this wasn't the result of a review, this was the result of my coming into the position of party leader with a position of my own. My position was, look, climate does change, mankind does make a difference. We should reduce emissions as far and as fast as we can, but, and this is the critical thing, not if it destroys jobs, if it drives industries offshore, and if it puts up people's cost of living. And it was for that reason that I opposed Kevin Rudd's emissions trading scheme. It was for that reason that I waged effectively a political war against Julia Gillard's carbon tax. And if you look back over Australia's recent political history, every time the coalition has created a contest on climate and energy, in the 2010 election, in the 2013 election, and in the 2019 election, we've done better than expected. Done very well, in fact. Every time we've Me Too'd Labor, with just a few quibbles here and there, 2016, 2022 and 2025, we've done badly, very badly. Politics is about creating a contest, and that's what we've got to do. Now, I don't think we necessarily need a theological contest over net zero, but by God, we certainly need a clear contest over energy policy. And energy has got to be affordable and reliable. And look, inevitably, if Labor continues on its current trajectory, which it will, it won't just be the power system which is being devastated by the emissions obsession. It'll be agriculture, because 90% of agricultural emissions come from herds. So our herds will be culled. Our access to meat, particularly beef, will be heavily curtailed. Air travel, transport emissions, we'll have much higher taxes, effectively carbon taxes on air travel. We will be forced to swap our reliable, efficient, affordable diesel and petrol-driven vehicles for electric cars, even though at the moment an electric car is a coal-fired car. So look, climate policy is going to upend the way we live, and it's wrong, and it should be opposed ferociously by a credible coalition.
And just building on what you said about the politics of it as well, we were told that the coalition needed to adopt net zero in 2022 and retain it in 2025. Otherwise, they weren't going to hold or win back the teal seats. Well, they lost them. They lost every single teal seat. The only one they won back was Goldstein. And Tim Wilson was not campaigning saying, vote for me because I back net zero. So net zero is a vote loser for the coalition, not a vote winner.
I agree with that. As I understand it, and I'm obviously not an elector in Goldstein, but as I understand it, Tim Wilson campaigned strongly on the pro-nuclear policy of the coalition, and he campaigned sensibly and strongly against Labor's capital tax on unrealised capital gains. Now, given the firestorm that has post-election enveloped Labor's policy on taxing unrealised capital gains, it's inexplicable to me why the coalition said almost nothing about this at an official level prior to the election. And had we been prepared to campaign for our pro-nuclear policy, which is the only way to get to net zero and keep the lights on, and if we'd been prepared to campaign against Labor's wealth tax, because that's what this unrealised capital gains tax is, I think the result could have been quite dramatically different. But for some reason, we just seemed to lose the will to fight.
All right, we'll turn to our last topic for today, which is the latest developments from the United States, in particular Trump's tariffs. Now, Trump has once again raised tariffs on many countries, although not Australia, where it seems to remain at 10%. So we've somewhat got lucky in that round of tariffs, but it seems that Trump is very much set on this approach. Now, there is a court challenge, as I understand it, and I don't know how that's going to end up, but it seems that Trump is not going to die wondering in his second and last term as president. How do you see this shaping up for the global economy and for Australia?
Well, Dan, there's no doubt that in purely economic terms, free trade maximises well-being, but maximising well-being is not the only important objective of government. Maximising national strength, securing national security are very, very important, arguably even more important considerations of government. What Donald Trump has grasped and is attempting to change is this essential fact. For the last 30 or 40 years, Communist China has been attempting to make itself independent of the world while make the world dependent on it. Very important point for people to grasp. It is part of the long-term strategy of the commissars in Beijing to make China independent of the world and to make the world dependent on China. And sure, in the short term, free trade between the United States and China was good for American consumers because they got cheaper electronic goods and white goods and so on. But in the long term, it's badly eroded America's industrial base. So much of what was once made in America is now made in China. I mean, American shipbuilding has almost completely collapsed. Korea and Japan are the only countries with serious shipbuilding industries other than China, and China's massively outproduces theirs. So what President Trump is trying to do is to rebuild America's industrial base, because in the end, you can't be a superpower if you can't produce your weapons. You can't produce your weapons if you haven't got a defence industrial base, and that means you've got to be able to make steel, you've got to be able to make aluminium, you've got to protect your high-tech sectors from technology theft, etc. That, at heart, is what the tariff wars are all about, and I think that we need to understand what America is trying to do. I think we should support the fundamental objective, although I would say that particularly the AUKUS partners, we should have free trade between ourselves, because we're almost entirely like-minded, and we are, or should be, completely joined at the hip when it comes to national security. So I see what Trump is trying to do. I sometimes think it's pursued in a slightly, I suppose, broad brush way, but I think his objective is pretty much completely right, and I think he needs to be understood and broadly supported.
All right, thanks, Tony. We'll leave it there for today. One thing I was just going to say is a couple of seasons ago, we had viewers and listeners could send in their questions to us, and we've decided that we'll give that another go. So I'll just address the audience. If you would like Tony to take a question of yours, send me an email at dwild@ipa.org.au, and we'll get to as many questions as possible, starting from our next chat. So, Tony, very much looking forward to seeing what we hear from our audience and viewers. All right, well, I'm looking forward to our chat next time.
Me too, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.